This is, of course, Behind the Scenes with Trails of Cold Steel 3. And we're going to start off with introductions for the panel.
日本ファルコムの近藤です。千の奇跡3ではプロデューサーを務めています。よろしくお願いします。
Hello, I am Toshihiro Kondo from Nihon Falcom, the producer for the Trails of series. Looking forward to this very much. And I'm Alan Costa, and I'll be helping out with translation.
I'm Travis Schroeds, marketing NISA. So, what about this Trails of Cold Steel 3? Obviously, this is a lineage of titles, not just in the Trails of Cold Steel series, but the Legend of Heroes going back many, many years. From 2D to 3D to HD, we're curious into a little bit some of the lessons learned for both the Falcom and Trails teams in the development process.
So one of the first things that we talked about amongst the development team when we started to work on Trails of Cold Steel 3 was one thing we really wanted to refine and take a deeper look at and make better were the graphics. As you know, Trails of Cold Steel 1 and 2 originally came out on the PlayStation Vita and the PlayStation 3, and so the graphics were kind of a little bit more subdued. And one of the biggest things that we looked at specifically, since this was PlayStation 4 and we had a little bit more power to work with, was the idea of the character graphics themselves. Specifically, the artwork for these games has been very well received everywhere, and we wanted to have the in-game models and the characters and their portraits and things, and their movement in-game to be much closer and much more representative of how the art itself looked.
New arc, new system, going over it's been about 1.5 years since the events of Trails of Cold Steel 2. We have new characters, we have returning characters with new designs. When revisiting these characters, how do you go about deciding how they're going to change in that meantime, but still retain the original character?
One thing you'll notice here is that, again, because we had the opportunity to really revise the graphics and bring them in a lot closer to what they were for the original illustrations, you'll notice here that we have lots of different illustration patterns that goes, and we'll talk about the process of how we bring these characters first from life on paper to life on the screen. So for the first thing, let's take a look at Rin. So as you know, Rin was a student in the prior 2 games, but now he's actually an instructor. And so the important thing here was how do we maintain what makes Rin, but show that he's in this new role and in this new costume. And so we looked carefully at the costume, and we thought the easiest way to show this movement from being a student to being an instructor was in what he was wearing in his jacket. And then for the other characters too, obviously they're taking steps into their life outside of school as well. For example, you have Alyssa now works at the Rhineford Corporation as a staff member there. You've got Fee, who's become a bracer. And so in the same way, we needed to update their costumes and their design to be representative of their new walks in life.
それぞれ職業についているので、職業ごとのデザインをつけていくという感じでデザインを決めていきました。
And then looking a little bit more carefully at how we're doing the actual, from idea to creation. Well, obviously, Altina here is a character who's not new to this iteration of the series, but she's a good representative example of how this process works. And I'd like to take a deeper look with you into how we design these characters and actually how they end up into the game. So the thing, for us at Falcom is that stories are a very, very important part of the game that we create. And so at a very early stage, the writers have already come up with a character's, their height, their hair color, and things like this, right down to the very grainy details. And so the designers, and having these fine details, they know the points that they absolutely have to hit, and then from there they create the rest of how their ideas for what the character should look like. Within this process here at the very beginning, you have ideas that are very divergent from maybe what a writer originally intended. For example, their hairstyle might be different, or they're wearing hats, or they're not wearing hats, or sometimes right down to how their very expression maybe is different from the type of personality that the writer had originally envisioned the character to be. And so once we've hashed out, okay, this is what we want to do with this character, this is how we want them to look. Again, we're going to use Altina as an example here. We actually go even deeper in the same direction, which is this.
Which I like to call, Where's Altina?
ほとんど区別つかないかもしれ
And
ない
so at this stage of the process, what's really important to us is we're thinking, okay, how is one of these designs going to be represented within the game, particularly when the character is involved in drama scenes, so they have various angles that they're going to be shot from, and then also how is this design going to appear in combat scenes and how are they going to look in combat?
どんどん絞り込んでいくんですね。
And even within this, you can kind of see just how detailed our designers and the people who work at our office want to be, because even once we've kind of even whittled it down from one of these, it's not uncommon to have the designer come up with 3 or 4 more patterns within this, just to make sure that things are exactly what we're looking for. And there's some times when we're caught in the thick of this and we just completely lose direction and we're like, oh my God, these all look the same. So we're going to take a break, we're going to put it down for a second, and then we're going to come back and approach this design later.
So next we have sort of the new character for the game, Kurt, or as I like to call this slide, one dour boy.
さっきのアルティ
So
ナ
who we looked at before obviously was Altina, who has shown up in prior games, but now we're going to take a quick look at Kurt, who is brand new to Trails of Cold Steel 3.
全く新しいキャラクターになります。で基本的にはまあやっぱり
So the thing about Kurt is, at the very beginning, we decided we wanted him to have this like silverish color hair. He was very serious. He's a user of the Vander's two-bladed school of swordsmanship, and so those were the points that we started with
それだ
when
けを
making
出
his
すため
design.
にまずはデザイナーがこういったパターンを出していきます。割とこう
And so here we have, various ideas of with that basic information we just gave. You've got an example of him just being very cool and collected. We have an image of him that's kind of more on the wild side, like Ash, and then other variations within that too of just how this character's personality is expressed through his design. And then from within that, again, we were able to kind of figure out a vector that we want to head for this character design. And then just like you saw previously with the Altina screen images that we showed you, and we did the very same thing for Kurt, and we just really refined what exactly we were looking for through many, many iterations. This is a game that has many tens of characters who come out and are playable in combat. And so this hopefully will give you a glimpse into how dedicated our designers are and how particular they are when it comes to designing these characters. Because again, for all of these characters that are coming out in battle, the exact same iterative process is being done. This is a time when it's quite a lot of fun, actually, to kind of go through this process and to figure out how these characters are going to be designed. But it's also kind of a time when we're like,
Sort of an interesting departure from the previous title in the series, and just wanted to go over quickly about changes to how the combat flows, how the UI flows.
So, one of the things about throughout this entire Trails series is we've had a lot of feedback about combat. And this isn't just talking about Trails of Cold Steel, but we're talking about going all the way back to the Trails in the Sky games. We had a lot of feedback from a lot of different people, not only in Japan, but also out here in the West as well. And pretty much we received the same feedback, which was combat's a little bit slow. It doesn't have a really good tempo. And one of the things that the designing staff was super stoked about when it came to developing for PlayStation 4 was that the DualShock 4 controller has so many more buttons.
ボタンがたくさんあればそれだけ操作を
So as you all know probably, up until now we've had a menu command system, right, where you have to go through nested menus in order to get to the command that you want to do to perform an action in combat. But now, thanks to, again, having so many more buttons to work with, we can actually assign pretty much one action to one button, so combat is much more quick.
対応させるということをまず最初に決めました。で基本的な操作としてはUI の方もです。
And what we were aiming for with this improvement was, again, to pick up the tempo of combat. And even though it is still a turn-based game at the end of the day, by allocating certain commands to just one button, you'll notice that things move a lot more swiftly. And so it actually ends up playing out much more similar to an action game than maybe what you'd think of as a command-style RPG.
いうところを目指していこうよという形で改善を進めていきました。
And so overall, I mean, in addition to the improvements we just talked about, we have the link attack system, which obviously has been around now for quite a while in terms of the Cold Steel series part of the overall series. And that system also was implemented in order to make combat feel a little bit speedier, and so that you could have your allies help you out and defeat enemies more quickly. And then in terms of even the battle UI itself, it's also been arranged in a way that you're able to get more information more quickly and understand it more easily. And so with all of these improvements in mind, I really think that this game, stands toe-to-toe with other JRPGs with having a really good responsive UI as well as quick combat.
Here we have a number of finished concepts of areas in the game, and just sort of wondering kind of how the team decides, it is really about the journey, right? And how they go about kind of figuring out how a game's locations sort of come to be.
今回のエレボニア
I'd like to talk now, like Travis was saying, about what makes Erebonia distinct and how we come up with designs for the places and locations that will appear within the game.
こういうことについてお話しします。千の奇跡1、2ではですね。
So in the first two installments of the Cold Steel series, we basically looked at the eastern part of the Erebonian Empire. But here, starting with 3, we're actually going to be taking more of a look at the western part of the empire. And what that means is new towns, new locations to explore.
マップ、新しい街がどんどん登場してきます。基本的には
And so thinking about the overall design direction for the Erebonian Empire, obviously Europe was kind of one place that we took inspiration from, but within the Erebonian Empire, there's also something called the Rheinford Corporation that you know, and they're kind of at the forefront and cutting edge of technology. And so what we realized then would be the best way to portray this would be kind of this old world feeling mixed with technology.
ことを意識しながら全体のデザインを決めていきました。今までもですね。
To kind of put this to compare and contrast with other locations that have appeared in the series, you've got Liberal, which is in the first, the Trails in the Sky part of the series, and that's kind of a very traditional, old school, old world design, and that's where we got the idea for that. When we get to the Crossbell parts of the series, we have Crossbell is kind of a financial center in the world, and so we kind of made it look like the big city. But at the same time, because it is the big city, you have crime going on and all these things like that. So we had to show a little bit of the chaos of a big city. And then finally, again, in contrast, we have the Erebonian Empire, which again is this mixture of old and new. The world of Trails is set in the continent of Zemuria, and Zemuria is huge. And so it was really important for us to look at each country individually and think about what made that country unique, what was going on there, and then even right down to the villages that would be in these countries. For example, maybe they're really industrially advanced. Maybe some of them are more traditional. Also, within these countries as well, maybe they're receiving some kind of influence from other cultures. Maybe, they have their own unique culture within this country as well. And so these are things that we think about carefully for each and every location that comes out in the games. Within this, as we kind of boil it down from the overall world, the country, the cities and the towns within this country, how do we make the towns then? Well, once we get to the towns, we think about what sections of the town are there? Do rich people live here? Do poor people live here? And then once we decide, kind of what's going on with each individual section, we determine, okay, what kind of houses are here? Okay, what kind of families or people inhabit these houses? And then within that, we're able to kind of get down to the nitty-gritty of each NPC within the game, thinking about where they live and what role they inhabit, and then creating the stories individually for them as well. And so we're often asked, how do you make such a detailed world and, such detailed characters and settings? What's the secret and the hint behind that? There is no secret or hint. It's hard work.
So now we're going to look at the iterative process behind designing, a single location. In this case, it'll be the top left, the keep there.
Think back to earlier in the presentation when we showed you the Altina iterative process for how we designed her. In the same way, buildings that are going to play important roles within the story, we have to do this very same thing to make sure that they look exactly like how we want them to look. The process is pretty much identical to what we did with, we showed you with Altina, so we're going to omit a lot of those images that are very iterative of what the original one was. And I think the point that you can really take away from this, again, going back to what we showed you with characters and then what we're showing you with how we design the buildings and things too, is that there is no shortcut to any of this. There's no magic behind it. This is all a lot of very hard work, a lot of really diligent work, and fretting over the details. What that means is that you don't take any shortcuts, that you don't allow yourself to slip and just kind of well, this is good enough. And so in the same way, we kind of figure out how we want the basic idea and shape of the building to look like, and then once we figure out the vector that we want to head in for it, we move on to a more, okay, let's refine this and get down to exactly what we're trying to do with this. And we make sure to finally create a design that we can be proud of and that we can happily put out into the world in the game. And within Falcom for the developers, we have kind of an unspoken, unwritten rule, and that rule is don't take a lot of time, but still make sure you're doing your best.
So next we're going to talk a little bit about what goes into creating the cutscenes that make up S-crafts, the special abilities for each character in the game.
And now I'd like to give you guys a look into what goes into creating the S-crafts for each of the characters. So thinking about S-crafts and what they mean to the characters is that this is the character's chance to show off their flashiest moves. And so it needs to be kind of something that ends up being very representative of the character, kind of like their own personal sign or billboard.
割と手数をかけてやっぱりこれも内容を詰めていきます。で割ともうすでにいろんな
And now at this point in the series, we have tons and tons of characters with tons and tons of S-crafts. And so the important thing, obviously, we need to think about is that, we don't overlap with how certain S-crafts play out. But other than thinking about things like that, we give a pretty high level of freedom to the designers to come up with what they want to do with the S-crafts. But to give you kind of an example of how this process can work sometimes, going back to Trails in the Sky, there's a character named Tita. And the scenario writer for the game, he wanted to give her a very down-to-earth S-craft, something that wasn't too fantastic, that was very grounded in realism. Whereas the designer decided, wouldn't it be really cool if we had her shoot beams out of a satellite in space? At first, we were really surprised at that idea. But then we realized that given the scope of the story that we were trying to tell, the fact that we were going to have so many characters, if we did try to make it really realistic, eventually we would really end up overlapping with other things like that. So we thought, well, maybe this can be a little bit more manga-esque in terms of how the S-crafts come out. And so we ended up going with it. And from there, we've kind of, again, decided to allow these designers the freedom to make what they want to make, and that's kind of become a tradition at Falcom. As you can see here, when we're making the S-crafts, what we do is we storyboard everything. And one of the important things that we tell the designers that they need to do is they need to do something, which in Japanese we have a very special word which relates to fiction called kisho tenketsu, which is basically what it means. It's that every story needs to have certain elements and parts to it that go from beginning, middle, climax, and end. And so every S-craft needs to kind of follow the same pattern throughout its duration. And we definitely make sure to have our designers adhere to that rule when they do create the S-crafts.
I like to point out frame 18, Altina destroying everybody and then just sort of going I'm blasting off, whatever.
Sometimes when staff gets tired, they have a habit of putting in little cute things like that with interesting commentary to go along with it.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about the Arcus 2, new to this game, sort of design and UI and how it plays out both sort of story-wise and how it looks in the game.
はい、AX2 のデザインはですね、この
So to talk a little bit about the world too, and how Orbment is used, there's various companies that make devices which are allow people in the world to use the Orbment. You've got, for example, the Renford Corporation in Erebonians. You've got Zeiss, the Zeiss Corporation, and then there's Bern for the Republic. There is the Epstein Corporation. So all these 4 different corporations make different apparatus that allow people to use Orbment.
会社がだいたいオーブメントというものをこの世界にリリースしているという状況になります。
And for each one of those that we just mentioned, all of them have their own design philosophies within the world that they make Orbment devices the way that they do. But specifically, we're going to be looking at what comes out in this game in this part of the world, which is the Erebonian Empire. And so these are mainly created by the Renford Corporation. And so they have their own specific design sense and their own goals for making these. And so the first idea that we had, if you take a peek in the upper left-hand corner of this image, you'll see that there's a kind of early concept for it, which is very similar to a smartphone. And so we considered this briefly, but then we realized to have characters fiddling around with their phones in the middle of combat would kind of end up overlapping with what we were doing with Tokyo Xanadu, so we decided not to use that particular. What we thought would be really cool as an action to have characters do would be kind of have this flip out motion, and so there's a certain type of phone, flip phones, you're all used to them. In Japan, we call them Galapagos, like the tortoise, those tortoise-style phones. So that was kind of the direction we wanted to take with it. But within the game, because it was being made by Renford, we had to think then, okay, so what kind, now that we have the basic function and action of what this is doing, what kind of thing would the Renford Corporation themselves make?
And
so after that, we have to think about, again, there's different applications for each, for the users of this. For example, you have the students at Thor's Academy and the ones that they use, you have the bracers and the one that they use, and then they have ones for military applications as well. And what we do from there is, as you can see here, the different models and where they're used by different locations and different people, the design's subtly different between each one of them.
So next up, wouldn't be much of an RPG without monsters to fight. So we're going to talk a little bit about monster design and implementation into the game.
So next up, we're going to be talking about monsters and how we leave it up to the designers, and basically we just leave it up to the designers. And the reason is because if we try to give them, it's kind of similar to what we talked about before, but if we try to give them too many limitations within this, they won't be able to come up with really cutting edge and exciting designs. So we try to give them as much freedom as we can. And so it might sound kind of like we're, skipping some valuable parts of design by not giving the designers more strict rules and regulations when it comes to how they're supposed to design. But the philosophy here, and the philosophy for our company here, is that we want to make good games and games that people care about and are invested in. And so if you start having too many rules for people, they're not able to express their creativity, A, and B, they also begin to use those rules as an excuse for not coming up with really good things. And so this is a little bit off from talking about monster design, but we kind of take this philosophy all the way to naming the games themselves. We don't try to restrict ourselves to this kind of game, so it needs to have this kind of title. Rather, we take it from the approach of, is this a good title for a game to begin with? And so, for example, let's take a look at Trails in the Sky, which is known as Sora no Kiseki in Japanese. The thing about this game is, first of all, it has a really nice ring to it in Japanese, and also it was different from a lot of the names of other games that were coming out at the same time. And so we really liked it and wanted to use it. However, if you've played the game, or at least when we were first designing the game, rather, we realized that Estelle and Joshua spent pretty much their entire journey on the ground, and the sky didn't come out in it at all. And so, at first, some members of the staff were kind of against it. Again, they're like, what does the sky have to do with the game that we've just, or the story that we've just written here? And so, rather, we found a way, well, then how can we implement this better into the game? So, for example, when Estelle and Joshua are moving from region to region, maybe they could move by airship. Maybe when we're showing these scenes, we can have really cool images of the sky coming up. When we show Estelle in certain scenes, we can have the sky as a motif behind her. So rather than, again, being constrained by this title, how can we make the game live up to this title? And how can we make it more appropriate to the title itself? And this might perhaps be something that sets us apart from other developers in Japan. And I know this might kind of sound like then your process is all over the place, but again, the idea here really isn't to be bound by anything like that, to have a lot of freedom to be able to make something good and to make something the best that we can. And so, to bring it back to the monsters here, we give our designers a lot of freedom to create the monsters that they want to create. And something else to note here is that the designers who are actually drawing and creating these monsters are also responsible for getting them into game as well, making the 3D and the things like that. And so we feel that by giving them a certain level of freedom, their motivation increases when they do, see their paper images come to life, as it were. And within that, though, I do have to say we do have some kind of rules and regulations in terms of this. And this is what kind of monsters would inhabit different types of areas. For example, like magical beast types, we have to think about, would these types of monsters actually inhabit this, a given area in the game? And so, as you know, there's 7 different, representative elements within the world. And so sometimes the monsters have to do with that in terms of like, are they evil spirits? Are they spirit type in general? Where will they appear? And so just to give you some examples, like to the left, upper left, you have magical beast. In the middle, you have like kind of these higher level beasts. And then, in addition to these types of things, we also have to think about mech design as well. And so, again, we divide it into who's using this mech. So you have mechs made by Rhineford Corporation, you have mechs that are used by Erebonians. So there's also, other cool monsters that our designers have come up with. There might be one that has like a sheep motif to it that you might be familiar with. And the fact that, a lot of you knew what I was talking about can just kind of, again, be proof of the fact that giving our designers this kind of freedom allows them to create monsters that are memorable. And in the same way, we want to continue developing games like this and to give the designers a place where they can have fun in their creations and have fun making what they want to make. And that's kind of what makes Falcom what it is.
Extremely briefly, as we're just about out of time, we talked about people, places, monsters, costumes, designs, but worlds are full of stuff, and how to fill the world with so much sort of themed stuff. So, this kind of goes over what we talked a little
before. But for the mechs, for example, again, we think about what country are these mechs going to be in, who's the manufacturer of the mechs that are there, and how does it best fit in with that place that it inhabits. And so, for example, obviously you have like Erebonia, you have Liberal, and they have their own organizations and companies that exist within each of those places, and so each of them creates their own kind of item. And then in the same way, you have like the organization Ouroboros, which also creates their own thing. And the thing about their technology is that it's kind of far and away above everything else that's in the world. And so we need to have their items represented by having this kind of otherworldly quality to them. And so I think overall this gives you a pretty clear idea of what we do. I could go on forever essentially telling you about each and every single little detail of the things up here. But I feel like the takeaway here for you to see is that just how we create our games. And I feel that if I kept going more, you'd probably get sick of me talking. So just to leave it up to, again, what we've said about how much freedom that we like to give ourselves and our designers, while at the same time really focusing on creating a good game. So I think we'll kind of leave it off at there. You're probably getting sick of me at this point. So I hope you did get a good feeling, though, for how we do create our games and the philosophy that we have behind it.
Thank you. Once more, a big round of applause for Mr. Kondo.
どうもありがとうございます。Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Trails of Cold Steel 3. The legend of Class 7 begins anew. Pre-order today.